This is True News, your best source for truth in a world of disinformation, deception, and propaganda. I'm Rick Wiles. Several things that I have observed over 15 years of news reporting is how the establishment news media sanitizes its own reporting. Sometimes the truth accidentally gets published, but the mainstream news media monkeys clean up their messes very quickly before too many people see it. I've seen news articles posted online late at night with some shocking revelations, only to discover in the morning that the entire article vanished while I slept. And so I learned a long time ago to copy that article quickly, because you can't be sure in the morning it's going to be there. Other times I've seen important quotes from individuals removed from the articles. Often I've seen the headlines altered to confuse the reader about the body of the story. Now, that happened today. Last night, we posted on TrueNews.com a Christian Science Monitor newspaper article that we found on AlaskaDispatch.com. AlaskaDispatch.com it's a left-wing progressive news site, but I check it out. They have good stories there. The original headline was, now this is it, amid global warming, is another little ice age coming? It was written by Mr. Peter Spotts of the Christian Science Monitor. The headline was still there this morning when I reviewed the article in preparation for today's program. By midday, however, the Alaska Dispatch adjusted the article. Well, they adjusted the headline. The article is still the same, but the headline says, a cosmic correlation between northern lights and global warming. How in the world did an article about an ice age suddenly become an article about global warming? Yes, the news manipulators were on the job today. They never take a break. Now, later today, MSN.com, that's Microsoft, MSN.com released an article that attempts to explain the pause in global warming. Yes, the official storyline is global warming has taken a little break. It's snoozing, but it's going to come back any day. MSN.com said a leaked draft of an important climate change report has made waves among some global warming skeptics who say it shows the Earth is not in danger. The UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report shows global warming patterns slowing down over the past 10 years, but many climatologists say the overall trend of heating will continue. The bulk of the 850 scientists who contributed to the report say that the current pause is too brief to make a difference in the trend of warming. Now, both of these articles just happened to appear on the same day I invited Mr. John Casey to come back to True News to discuss his scientific research about the sun's present activity. He is the president of the Space and Science Research Corporation in Orlando, Florida. He is a former White House Space Program advisor, a space shuttle engineer, and consultant to NASA. His newest book is Cold Sun. And so it's a pleasure to have Mr. John Casey back on True News. John, how are you?
Just fine, Rick. Thanks for asking me back.
Well, as you were listening to that introduction, are you surprised that the Alaska Dispatch changed the headline of the article to global warming?
It took a great deal of self-preservation not to laugh as you were mentioning those articles.
Yeah, I had to mute your mic so we wouldn't hear you chuckling, you know. But this happens often. Particularly you see it in global warming articles. They're constantly massaging the articles and adjusting the headlines and removing statements that they don't like. But here's a case where, like I said, last night, even today, the Alaska Dispatch was asking the question, is there an ice age coming? And somehow in the last couple of hours, they flipped it around and said it's global warming. And but the article remains the same. Now, this other report, I know you probably haven't even had time to see it because it just came out minutes ago. This UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, saying that the pause in warming is too brief to make a difference. What do you think about this?
Well, if you simply go back and look at the reports that they began issuing from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change since 1990, you'll find out that they have 95% certainty that all of their predictions for global temperature would be true, would be believable, and you could go to the bank with them. Now, all of those models, and the UN had about 20 models to start off with, predicted nothing but increasing temperature with no pause, no cooling, no variation until the year 2100, when supposedly all the glaciers will have melted and will be flooded throughout the world with higher sea levels. So it's a curious statement of human nature, how we react when we find out we've been wrong about things. The UN and all of their supporters have been backpedaling furiously for quite some time now that the international community's made it quite clear that global warming ended years ago. And this pause, which they say is just an intervening quiet period until global warming returns, was simply never possible anyway, according to their own guidelines, according to their own predictions. So they're doing the best they can to adjust to the obvious facts that their theories and the greenhouse gas effect has been wrong all along.
John, you had a press conference in Miami recently to announce some very important new findings. Tell us what you announced.
This week, in fact, Wednesday night from 7 to 9, we had a news conference just west of Miami in Plantation, Florida. A number of groups were represented. Some media were there, some local officials, and some planning officials who represent those folks who are considering what to do with the cities and the communities based on the UN sea level rise predictions. Our news conference had a very important purpose. We, in fact, issued a declaration that sea level rise on a global basis was coming to an end. That end we actually specified would be no earlier than the middle of next year and no later than 2020, about 6 years from now, and could come any time during that period. And once that begins, sea levels will drop rapidly and return to where they were 200 years ago by the year 2031.
And 200 years ago just happened to be approximately the end of the last little ice age.
Well, 200 years ago was, in fact, the same point in time when we had what is called our last solar hibernation, the last time the sun went into hibernation, cut back on its energy output, and the Earth got very cold during that time. A lot of people here in the U.S. Froze to death and starved to death because crops were killed. We even had 1 year where we had snow in the middle of August, which killed much of the crops that were left during the New England growing season back then.
Mm-hmm.
What's happening is this new cold era that's coming, which will cause the oceans to shrink as cold water does when it gets cold, is caused by a once every 206-year cycle of the sun. And this comes around like clockwork. It was the basis for my prediction and first press release back in 2007 when I announced global warming was going to end and a new cold climate was going to begin.
Now, the global warming gang has been hysterically warning for years that the seas are going to rise, cities are going to go under, islands are going to be swallowed by the ocean. And, they've terrified a lot of people along coastal areas and on islands around the world. I travel a lot into the Caribbean islands, and, the people there they're hearing these news reports from America and Europe that the islands are going to go underwater. And, you have government leaders on the islands who are meeting with UN officials to talk about how they can prevent their islands from being swallowed by the sea. What you're saying is the Earth has been doing this for a long, long time, and it's a 206-year cycle.
Exactly. That's the solar hibernation cycle, but there's actually another cycle that affects sea levels, one that runs about every 60 years or so. And there are other cycles as well, but the one that's of most concern is the 206 year right now. By the way, speaking of those islands and the threat of sea level rise to them, joining us last night via Skype, we had other scientists from around the world who are experts in various fields. We had the very highly regarded Dr. Niels Axel Morner, who joined us and spoke to the audience and gave a presentation. He was the guy in charge of a international group that went out to the Pacific Islands to investigate their claims of sea level rise and found them to be unfounded and largely based on politics and so forth. He's written a number of papers on the subject, and last Wednesday night, he joined us to echo my prediction for a new global cooling era, dangerously so cold, and as a result, the sea levels will drop by a significant amount.
How much has the sea increased over these years during this last warming cycle?
There are two numbers, but the one that's most referenced is the roughly 7 to 8 inches that we've had in the last 100 years, and of course more than that if you go back to the last solar hibernation back around 1800 or so. So we're looking at our forecast saying that the sea levels will return to where they were, so probably between an 8 and a 10-inch drop in global sea levels will be starting here soon.
And you're saying it should start next year, 2014?
It would start no early than the middle of next year. And going back to your comment about the MSN article, one of the articles I brought to the conference and pointed out to everyone who attended was an article from Russia whereby researchers at the Russian Academy of Sciences have said not only is a cold era coming, but a new little ice age will in fact start next year. Now, this is what the Russian scientists are saying. And, of course, all of that is covered up and not reported here in the U.S., much as my research and my predictions have been covered up since I began 7 years ago.
I think the leading scientist in Russia, is it Dr. Abdulmasatov?
Dr. Habibullo Abdusamatov, a real tongue twister. But
I was close. I was close.
Yeah. He is one of many that are telling the truth about the climate, and it's a sad situation we're in our country, where scientific integrity is now surely the lowest it's been since our country began. We now have a situation where the Russians are way ahead of us on this new cold era, and their scientists are free to talk about it. Now, this is the former communist Soviet Union, and their scientists have no problem going to the media and the media talking and writing articles about their predictions for a new cold era.
Well, when you look at a
we
map,
can't do that.
Yeah, when you look at a map of how much of Russia is far north on the planet, they have a vested interest in knowing the truth about the climate.
Oh, absolutely. And they have a long history of suffering through cold eras, starvation, warfare. All of these things tend to occur during these cold eras. And just as you pointed out, if you get a globe out or get an atlas out, the southernmost part of the former Soviet Union, their wheat belt, was the Ukraine. The Ukraine is on the same level as Canada, which means most of Russia far north of the Ukraine is northern Canada in latitude. Now, that tells you how cold this country can be.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that the mainstream news media has been saying a lot in the past couple of months is that they've been focusing on the ice melting at the North Pole, and yet reports from the South Pole show the Antarctic ice level is at its highest ever. That's
correct. The media and the warmist community routinely talks about this threat of warming and tries to find any single instance of warming month to month, year to year, so that they can point to it and say, aha, See, we told you there is global warming, there is man's influence, and they automatically tie the two together, even though there's no science to do so.
Okay, why is the north?
Tie them together.
Why is the North Pole of the planet still warming, and the South Pole is freezing up?
First off, the southern hemisphere leads the progress into the solar hibernation, and that's why for 30 years now, the Antarctic area has been getting colder and colder and colder, and the ice mass balance is growing down there. And furthermore, the Antarctic sea ice, that's the portion that freezes around the continent during the wintertime, has recently set new records for sea ice extent. Furthermore, if you look at the Arctic in 2011 and 12 did have a significant melt and reduction in sea ice extent, but NASA research showed a lot of that was not really melting, but in fact the shift in polar winds that fundamentally blew the ice toward Greenland. And you have NOAA has a radar map showing how much the ice piled up against the Greenland north coast, and because of this wind effect. Bottom line, though, is the Antarctic and the Arctic are getting colder. The Arctic phase of cold is beginning now. We had also at our news conference the co-editor of our Global Climate Status Report, Dr. Ali Hamlam from the University of Oslo, Norway. He's a glaciologist, expert on the Arctic and Greenland and so forth, and he has indicated that the Arctic, Greenland waters, and oceans around them are now going into cold phase. That will bring them in sync with the other Atlantic cold phase start and the Pacific, which has already been in cold phase for some years. By the way, on sea level rise, we don't hear anything from people in California about sea level rise, only here in the Miami Atlantic coast area. The reason is the Pacific has already turned cold and sea levels are dropping out there.
Mm-hmm. About 2 weeks ago, a major newspaper in Denmark published a 2-page story on a coming ice age. Are you seeing signs that the Europeans are becoming much more aware that something different is happening other than what they've been told about global warming?
Absolutely, and we see that in every country now. 2 years ago, the Polish Meteorological Office had predicted a little ice age 1,000 years long was about to hit Russia. And I think I thought they were off at least a year in their prediction, but the Germans, even the Meteorological Office in the UK, which has long been pushing man-made global warming, finally admitted there's been no growth in global warming for 16 years. And with 100, 200, and 3-year cold weather records that have been set 3 out of the 5 last years in Great Britain, where they were snowed in and had very difficult times, the people have finally said, listen, you can't be telling us the Earth is warming when we're setting 300-year cold temperature records.
Okay, let's talk about here in the USA this summer, particularly the month of August. It's been very cool.
It has. We've had 3 or 4 highly unusual cold weather fronts that came through right here in the middle of summer. And Atlanta, Georgia, for example, set several new 100-year cold temperature records in the last 2 weeks. I think it was Thursday of last week, the high in Atlanta, the high, midsummer, 66 degrees.
Mm-hmm. I just saw a report a few days ago, something like 2,900 communities set records in August for cool temperatures. We have seen, the city of Pittsburgh shut down all the city swimming pools for the month of August because it was too cold to go swimming.
Amazing, isn't it?
It is. And
of course, the mainstream media doesn't want to discuss it.
No, not at all. Not at all. And if you just search online under cool temperatures, it's amazing how many local stories will appear. And you see this pattern all over the United States. Farmers talking about their harvest is down because of the cool temperatures, or honey production down in many places because of cool temperatures. So there's already an impact on food production. When do you think we're going to start really seeing a noticeable change?
Well, for those of us who monitor global temperatures in the atmosphere and the oceans and so forth, we've already seen it, because the oceans globally have been cooling for 10 years now. 10 years. And the oceans lead the change in global climate. Atmospheres follow. The atmospheric cooling period began shortly after I predicted it, in fact, in 2007. So for 7 years now, the atmosphere has been cooling, but 10 long years, the oceans have been cooling and fairly rapid. All of these cooling rates are fairly rapid when compared with the warming rates over the last 200 years. So it's already begun.
Yes.
We're waiting for a dramatic event, a dramatic cooling event, and it almost happened this spring. We had a long cold and then a cold and wet planting period, and we almost didn't make planting for the northern states, and that would have been our first cold weather crop disaster. We came within 2 weeks of it.
In a little ice age, is there a point that it's like the planet's thermostat is adjusted and there is a sudden switch to a cooling cycle? Or is it gradual?
Yes. If you look at the temperature curves for past solar hibernations, there's a slight dip, and then you fall off a cliff, in essence, to a very low temperature base. You stay at that low temperature base for 20 years or so, and then you rapidly come back out of it. Now, when we come back out of this next cold era in the 2040s, we won't be coming back to near anything like the global warming we've just had. And in fact, our long-term forecast shows that this last global warming era that we've been through, and we've had many in the last 2,000 years, but this last one is probably the last one for the human race for quite some time.
That's a pretty strong statement.
Well, that's what the data shows.
Mm-hmm. Explain that to us.
Well, if you look at the primary drivers and schedulers of climate change come from the sun. Mankind has essentially nothing to do with major climate variation. And if you understand and study and learn these various cycles of the sun, you can, in fact, predict climate change with a high degree of accuracy, somewhere over 90%. That's what we've been doing since 2007. I say we, me and the scientists around the world who are associated with me. They're listed at the website, but there are many others like me in other countries trying to convince their people that you need to study these natural cycles because they are really the drivers of climate change and not what we've been told. But once you do study them, you realize how reliable they are and that you can use them to predict future events.
When your book came out, Cold Sun, I stayed up one night, probably to 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and read the entire book, and it definitely impacted me. Tell us what you're seeing right now as of late August. What is the state of the sun right now since the last time you and I have talked? What are the changes?
Well, first off, here we are in 2013. We are, in effect, at the top of the 11-year solar cycle curve. This is what we learned about in high school. When you count these things by counting the number of sunspots, and when you get a certain number, then you've passed your peak, and then it drops off and you get another 11-year solar cycle. Here we are at the peak of the solar cycle number 24, and it is the weakest solar cycle in over 100 years. We do forecast, along with many other scientists now, who've been quiet in the background, but now they're stepping up. And by the way, NASA, the National Solar Observatory, and the U.S. Air Force also confirmed my prediction for a solar hibernation, and they are saying that the next 2 solar cycles will be the weakest in over 200 years. So once the sun gets weak, it stops warming the planet like we've been used to, and we start to get cold. It's that simple. The sun is cutting back on its energy output during these hibernations. So for the next 20 to 30 years, we're going to get cold as we were back in 1800.
John, do you think you mentioned some U.S. Agencies are now confirming your research? Do you think at other levels of the U.S. government, military, the intelligence agencies, national security, do you think that they are aware of these things and are quietly making preparations for a significant change in the climate?
Well, I will tell you first off, all the major U.S. agencies are well aware of my predictions over the years, to include the press release that went out yesterday from the Sea Level Rise News Conference. I've made sure that the U.S. government, the mainstream media, has been well aware of everything for the last 7 years. So there's no real secrets here. Now, as far as preparation, unfortunately, there is none. All of the data I see, all of the feedback I see says that the government agencies are simply too afraid to fight the president on this global warming myth. And I will also tell you there's not $1 and not one office committed in the U.S. government to getting our country ready for the only climate that does exist, and that's the new cold climate.
I have a feeling, and it's not a prediction. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a weather forecaster, but I just my gut feeling that this fall here in the United States that we're going to see abnormal early snowfall in many areas. And the newspapers and the media will talk about freak storms and all that kind of stuff. That nobody will put two and two together. But I would not be surprised that some areas of the country have very early snowfall this year, and I suspect that this winter is going to be brutally cold and snowy, and that we're going to go like last year, deep into late spring, even early summer, and communities still getting significant snowfall. What do you think?
Well, certainly that would not surprise me. Our predictions and that of our Russian colleagues say we are very, very close to that fall off the cliff scenario I mentioned, and that could in fact occur. It wouldn't be at all a surprise. We certainly have had all the indicators, and again, we came very close to our first big crop damage at the end of this winter. So, and if you look back, winter theoretically starts December the 21st. It's based on a position of the sun in the sky, and people use that as a hallmark. But we've had early winters over the last 10 years, and that's surprised a lot of people. And it seems like they're getting earlier and earlier. Don't forget the Snowtober we had a couple of years ago. Record snow in October, not November, not December when it used to fall, but October. So if we have snow in October again, or even September, I would not be surprised.
From historical records of the last little ice age, 200 to 300 years ago, what can we anticipate will happen in this next little ice age? Well,
let me clarify. There are two scenarios we are looking at that we have documented in our Global Climate Status Report, which anyone can download from the Space and Science website. Those two scenarios include either a similar winter to what we had in early 1800s, or a winter like some scientists are saying, which could be like the Little Ice Age from 1600 to 1745. And that, if we have that, then that's going to be a very different world from the one that you and I have grown up in. The one we're forecasting as of current is going to be bad enough. We're going to have significant global massive crop losses and major social upheaval as a minimum based on our prediction of how cold it's going to get and how much crop damage we're going to see.
And your prediction is the best case of the two options?
Yes, that's the best case.
Oh, great.
If, in fact, we go into the scenario that some scientists are alleging, including those from the Air Force, we're talking about biblical scale suffering around the globe once that kind of cold hits. Another little ice age at a time when we have 7 billion more people on the planet than we had in 1800 would truly be a test of the human species.
Well, that's something to ponder and contemplate, how life will change on this planet. What do you think our listeners should be doing?
Well, my recommendation and I get this question at the end of every conference I give, there are some basics. Number one, get informed. Read all you can about what happened during the last time this solar hibernation hit, which, again, was from 1793 to 1830 here in the U.S. and globally. You can also go back and study the Little Ice Age from 1600 to 1745. There's a lot of literature about that. But I strongly recommend everyone go to our website, spaceandscience.net. There's a great deal of information there, including lots of other scientists who are predicting the same cold weather. You can also download the book Cold Sun, which describes a lot of this in detail. You can download the current global climate status report with all the charts and the data, so that you don't need to argue with your friends and neighbors. Just show them the chart and they can see for themselves. Global temperatures are dropping rapidly and have been for years. There is no global warming, and they can get all of that. So step one is get informed, get knowledgeable.
All right.
Step two is recognizing that this is nothing more than Mother Nature repeating what she's done every 206 years. We need to go back and say, okay, what happened the last time? Well, what happened was people ran out of food. We're an advanced society with the greatest communications capability mankind's ever had. We should be able to communicate the issue of simply storing some food so you can get through the worst of the times. And then, of course, you need to be prepared for some social upheaval. So those are the three things I say you need to start with.
Well, John, here's the problem. You can save and store some food for the first year, but, best case scenario, if this is a 40-year cycle, worst case scenario, a 200-year cycle, how are you going to store food to last 40 to 200 years? I mean, there's going to be a dramatic decline in the availability of food.
Yes, no question about it. This will test everyone's resolve, regardless what scenario, whether it's an 1800 class or a 1600 class cold period. And by the way, those are given different names. There's the Dalton minimum and there's the Maunder minimum. Maunder is a guy who studied the Little Ice Age. So whether it's a Dalton or a Maunder class solar hibernation, each will test us severely. With regard to your specific question about, if the cold airs are this long, how can you store that much food? Bear in mind, number one, we're still going to have seasons. We're still going to have summer, winter, spring, and fall. It's just that the winters are going to be much longer and much more brutal. And we need to also be prepared for two other events. Number one, there will be freak cold weather fronts that sweep down from the Arctic. And that's what we need to be prepared for. Let's say we got a normal temperature year for one of these years, and we're growing our crops, and then all of a sudden a freak cold front comes down and wipes it out. The second third thing we need to be prepared for. The first thing is the gradual and then the long-term drop of temperature for 20 or 30 years. Then you got number two, the freak cold events. But number three, if you go back and look at history, during these major solar hibernations, we also have our worst earthquakes and our worst volcanic eruptions. Now, when the volcanoes go off, and if they're large enough, like Mount Tambora in 1815, they can cover the globe with a layer of dust, which makes everything even colder. So we need to watch the news reports and study our geographical online channels and keep abreast of what's happening. So those are the three main things we need to look for.
Johnny, do you know why there is a connection between ice age and increased volcanic activity?
We don't really fully understand. There's been little to no research done. Our group, the other group I'm associated with, the International Earthquake and Volcano Prediction Center, is looking at this when we can, but there's no funding for it. The only science funding for climate change based on solar variation is self-funded, like mine and people like me. The government, again, is not putting $1 into studying what really does cause the climate change, and much less these collateral effects like earthquakes and volcanoes. There are a couple of theories, but no real hard evidence yet to suggest one is correct.
Even with your best case scenario, do you expect to see dislocation of populations, migration of people?
Absolutely.
So some northern cities may end up being depopulated as people move to southern, warmer areas.
Yes, and as we see these much colder eras come in and we see collapse of the utility grid that simply cannot handle the heating that's going to be needed, people are just going to say, I've had enough shoveling snow and I've had enough freezing weather, I'm going to move south. So this has happened before. It's not unusual.
I know. Can you give, for our listeners, we have listeners in Canada. We have listeners in, of course, Alaska and throughout the United States, in fact, all over the world. But for those in the Northern Hemisphere, let's just say right here in the USA and Canada, for listeners who are in Canada or the Northern United States, the Dakotas, Montana, Michigan, can you give them a picture of what a winter would look like if we do go into this ice age?
There is no one alive that has been through the severity and depth of cold we're about to see. One can look at the worst winters you've ever been through before and add 30 or 40% to that, because we've never been through this before. We have as a species, but not our generation or the generation coming up. We just don't have any experience base. But what we do know in studying history is that these things are very traumatic for those population groups who are unprepared, and because of the global warming propaganda we've had for 23 years now, simply refuse to believe it, even when they're shown the charts that temperature hasn't grown for 16 years, when they're shown the charts that the oceans have been cooling for 10 years, they still refuse to believe it. They still want to accept things that are not real. So you've got all of those people, and they will go into panic. They will go into shock when there's no wheat on the shelves in the stores. And when these cold events start happening, if you go back and look at history, we're just going to see the same thing. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means we're probably going to see some really bad cold events that knock out a significant percentage of our corn, wheat, and soybeans. And when that happens, and we get these first food shortages, then people will realize that, this thing is real. But it may be too late by then.
One last question based on your current research. When do you expect that we're going to start experiencing significantly cold weather? I know the Russians are saying 2014. Are you willing to make a prediction, or are you going to wait?
Well, my predictions are climate predictions as opposed to weather predictions, and I tend to stay in that realm because my science is based on that. I don't do weather, and when I've tried to do weather, it's taken me away from what I know best.
So the difference between weather and climate, and you're talking long-range climate change. Okay.
So on a long-range basis, most of the ill effects of this new cold air we're going to start feeling similar to the sea level drop. So between the middle of next year and 2020, it's going to be so obvious to the rest of the world and here in the U.S. that this new cold climate is real. We'll have enough hits during that period that people will have realized that this thing is what it is and it's coming and it's here. And then things get bad after 2020.
Mm-hmm.
Then things drop very quickly into the cold basin of the 2030s and 2040s. And during some of those years, I have little doubt that the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Canada will have to notify other nations of the world that they will be unable to export food to them because we won't have enough for our own people.
And we just happen to be in the war cycle at the same time.
Yes.
The historic war cycle, which...
Yep.
And
there's a reason for that connection, too. If you go back and look at history, unfortunately, when these solar events hit, we get the cold weather. When the cold weather comes in, crops die off. And human nature is that one of the responses to dire times is warfare.
That's right. Napoleon said armies move on its stomach.
He should have followed his own advice by not launching a Russian winter campaign from 1812 to 1813. He went in with 600,000. He came back with 40.
That's right. And it was the Ice Age that did him in.
Did him in. He didn't have a John Casey on his staff to tell him not to do that.
That's right. That's right. Well, the book is Cold Sun, and you can go to coldsun.net to read about the book. Of course, you can order it at Amazon. And the research is at Space and Science. Is it spaceandscienceresearch.net?
Spaceandscience.net.
Spaceandscience.net. John Casey, our guest today. Thank you, John. Appreciate you taking time to be on True News.
Always a pleasure, Rick. Thank you, sir.
Well, we've come to the end of another edition of True News.